Picture this: the council hall packed wall to wall, every chair taken and guards lining the doors, when the envoy from the outer territories leaned over the long table and looked straight at Lena. An unimportant Omega healer with no standing and no say. "We will not rearrange 5 territories' boundaries for her convenience," he said, the words landing flat and final. She had no idea the Alpha King of those 5 territories had already found her weeks earlier at the creek, or that one quiet morning would shift far more than any map line. What was it about that lone healer that made him ride the eastern slope twice over? Lena Harrow had been at the Frostveil border post 8 months when the trouble started, sent alone to keep the patrol wolves patched and the pups dosed through winter. The pack treated her like a useful fixture, the way you notice a well-placed lantern but never ask how it got lit. She kept to her plants and the compounds she mixed from dried roots and bark, the work quiet and steady after years of learning it the hard way. Most days she slipped by without notice, which suited her fine until the boundary question rose. Then Rylan Kaur appeared on the bank while she was still knee-deep in Willow Creek mud, one boot sunk past the ankle and the other leg twisted from an old trick she had read in a survival manual years back. He wore worn riding leathers, nothing polished, and watched the stubborn goat Uncle Bram glare at her from the far bank. Lena laughed despite herself, the sound carrying over the water. Rylan stepped closer, voice low. Rotated the leg like the manuals say. Smart. He offered his hand, steady and calloused, and pulled her free with one clean motion. The mud let go with a wet pop that almost made him smile. He asked about the poultice she had packed on a patrol wolf's shoulder the week before, not the usual polite question but one that showed he had actually checked the animal. She answered plain, naming the wintergreen and comfrey mix. He nodded once, offered the practical advice not to let the mud dry on her boots, and rode on. Thursday patrols started bringing him back to the slope. After the second ride he gave her clearance to forage the rare ridge herbs no one else touched, the ones that eased lung fever in the pups. Lena found the stand on a clear afternoon, the air sharp with pine resin, and the small permission felt like the first real room she had been given. Small conversations followed on Wednesdays, him asking after inventory, her answering without the usual careful distance. The work stayed her own, the way she liked it. She still didn't know the Alpha King was already watching the quiet healer the envoy would later call worthless. Now picture what happened the next morning, when the envoy from the eastern ridges came striding into the main clearing with his polished boots and that silver-stitched cloak that caught every ray of sun. His name was Varek Thorn, and he carried the kind of papers that made the younger wolves stand straighter. He had come to settle the boundary markers once and for all, he said, and he wanted every healer account on his desk by noon. Lena stayed back by the creek line at first, the way she always did when outsiders arrived, her fingers still smelling of pine resin from the poultice she had mixed the night before. But the trouble showed up before the ink even dried on those papers. One of the young scouts limped in from the northern line, a deep gash along his flank that no quick field wrap could stop. The wound carried that sharp, metallic edge of silver fleck, the kind that spreads if you do not know the counter-herbs by heart. Varek looked the scout over once, then turned to the gathered circle. "We have no time for village remedies," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Send for the ridge apothecary. This one needs proper training, not whatever the quiet woman keeps in her satchel." Lena felt the words land like they always did, a quiet dismissal she had learned to swallow. Yet she also felt the weight of that small carved figurine inside the satchel's inner pocket, the one her mother had pressed into her hands the last summer before the old pack lines fell. She touched it now without thinking, the smooth grain warm from her body heat, and stepped forward anyway. Rylan was already there, watching the scout's shallow breathing, but it was the envoy who blocked her path. She did not argue. Instead she knelt, pulled the vial of wintergreen comfrey she always carried, and began the slow work of drawing the silver out before it settled in the blood. The scout's breathing eased before the first full minute passed, and a low murmur moved through the wolves who had stayed to watch. Rylan said nothing at first, only nodded once when the bleeding slowed. Varek, though, kept his gaze on the carved figurine that had slipped into view when Lena opened the satchel flap wider. Something shifted in his eyes, like a man recognizing an old mark he thought long buried. That night the pack lit the boundary fires early. Lena stayed by the creek again, grinding more root for the scouts' next dose, but Rylan found her there once the others had drifted off. He asked about the figurine without prying, and she answered that it had crossed 3 generations of healers who knew the ridge herbs by scent alone. He listened the way he had on those Thursday rides, quiet and steady, then told her the envoy's maps were missing the upper spring line that only the original records ever marked. The permission to forage the rare stand felt smaller now, almost fragile, yet the conversation lingered longer than any before. The mini-crisis came 2 days later when 3 more scouts returned fevered, the silver having spread farther than any of them admitted. Varek ordered the ridge healer summoned again, but the rider came back alone. The man refused the call, citing old grudges with the eastern line. That left only Lena's satchel and the knowledge no one else had asked for. She worked through the night under Rylan's watch, the figurine laid out on a flat stone beside her so she could keep one hand on it for balance when the mixing grew precise. The pups in the outer den slept easier by dawn, and word of it moved through the pack like a low wind. Still, Varek held the ledgers. He told the circle that morning that the boundary question could not rest on the hands of someone without formal standing, and he set Lena's name at the bottom of the list with a single line through it. Lena said nothing, only folded the figurine back into its pocket and returned to the creek where the mud still held the shape of her boots. Rylan rode out again on the Thursday patrol, but this time he carried one of the old boundary stones with him, the kind that bore markings no envoy had ever been shown. The Alpha King kept his distance, the way he always had, yet the quiet watching had turned into something more deliberate, a patience that matched her own. Now here's the part that changed everything for Lena, and you have to picture how quiet that creek spot stayed even while the whole ridge held its breath. Rylan came back from that Thursday patrol with the boundary stone wrapped in his saddle blanket, and he laid it in front of the circle without a word. The markings on it matched the ones only the first ridge healers had ever set down, the ones Varek's own ledgers had overwritten years ago. Nobody said her name at first. They just stared at the stone and at the list where her name still sat crossed through at the bottom. Varek called the circle again 2 mornings later, and this time he brought the envoy's maps laid out on the long table. The silver fever had reached the outer dens proper by then, and 3 more scouts couldn't stand. He pointed at the maps and said the boundary question needed someone with formal standing to settle it once and for all. Lena stood at the back with the figurine in her pocket, the way she always had, and she didn't speak until Rylan nodded once in her direction. She pulled the old records from the satchel she'd kept under the bench for 40 years. The handwriting matched the stones exactly, and every line showed where the upper spring fed the rare herbs nobody else could find. The circle went still the way a room does when the wind changes. Varek's face didn't move at first, but you could see the moment the pieces landed for him. The man who'd called her name last on every list now watched the same men who'd mocked her satchel open the maps again and trace the springs they had missed. That evening Varek found her by the creek alone. He waited until she finished washing the root from her hands, then he spoke low enough that only she could hear. "I held those ledgers like they were the truth because I needed them to be," he said. "I was wrong to cross your name through." He didn't ask for anything back, just stood there until she nodded once and went back to the grinding stone. The public part came the next morning when the full pack gathered at the old stones to settle the boundary line before the envoy returned. Varek stood in the center and pointed to the maps, then to Lena's records spread beside them. He told every wolf there that the ridge healer they had dismissed had carried the original marks all along, the ones that kept the silver from spreading farther. Then he turned to her and said it loud enough for the outer dens to hear, the standing she never asked for was hers by right, and the list was torn in front of them. Rylan rode beside her on the way back to the creek that afternoon. He didn't say much, just kept the figurine in his own pocket until she reached for it, and the quiet between them felt like the Thursday rides again, only steadier. The pups in the outer dens played farther out now, and the scent of root and creek mud mixed with the new growth along the spring line. A month later the pack kept the boundary fires lit with the old stones in their proper places. Lena still ground the root when the scouts needed it, but the circle asked her opinion before any ledger was opened. Varek made the envoy sign the corrected maps in front of the same men who had once turned their backs, and he spoke her name first when the ink dried. The figurine sits on the flat stone by the creek now, warmed by the sun instead of hidden in a pocket. What stuck with everyone, and what you come to see when a lifetime of quiet work finally lands in the right hands, is that respect like that doesn't arrive all at once. It comes from the same patience that keeps a healer grinding root through the night, the same steady ride that brings an old stone back where it belongs. Lena never raised her voice to claim it. She just stayed at the creek, and the ridge remembered who had known its sense all along.